welcome back. Or if this is your first visit, thank you for being here in this quiet corner of time. Tonight, we'll wander a little farther from the castles and chapels and step into the shadows, where stories were only whispered, never written down. You may have heard of queens and knights, of saints and kings, but what about the women whose names were never known? The ones who lived by candlelight, behind shutters that never opened in the daylight. In the Middle Ages, love wasn't always gentle, and for some women, it wasn't even a choice. They sold the only thing they had, not for pleasure but simply to survive. Tonight, we'll step into the world of medieval prostitutes, scorned, desired, and then forgotten. We'll walk down cobbled alleys under the torchlight, listen to laughter echoing behind tavern doors, and maybe, just for a moment, we'll hear the heartbeat of someone who was never allowed to be remembered. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through the strange corners of history, please consider liking or subscribing for more. It helps more than you might think, and you'll always have a seat by this fire. Are you ready? Then let's begin right now. If you're picturing a medieval prostitute as a seductive lady in a red dress with a daring slit up the thigh, lips red as wine, fanning herself with peacock feathers, well, sorry to say, you've wandered into a Renaissance masquerade ball. Prostitutes in the Middle Ages didn't exactly wear slitted gowns. What they had more of were lice, a tattered tent near the riverbank, and the half-contemptuous, half-hungry stares of castle guards. As for the title prostitute, not everyone even earned it. In a society where any step off the path of virtue was seen as a tumble into damnation, the term prostitute wasn't just a label, it was a class. And that class was thoroughly categorised. Medieval folks classified sex workers much like livestock, by rank, location of service, and even time of operation. Some women were festival night workers, others early morning shift specialists targeting travelling merchants. And surprisingly, in certain regions, prostitutes were granted licences to work. Local authorities figured, if you can't ban it, manage it. So red light districts sprang up, officially sanctioned tax-paying, with brothel rulebooks declaring things like no arguing with clients, no revealing customer identities. Of course, there were many others, the unregistered workers, who lived in the shadows of society. They were beaten, shunned, and often worked for nothing after being stiffed on their pay, not to mention being stalked by pious monks who'd pressure them into repentance, which meant scrubbing church floors, fasting and abstinence, for life. In short, being a prostitute in the Middle Ages was a semi-official social role. They weren't a monolithic group, but rather a collection of vastly different fates, from those pushed to the margins of society to those who turned that very margin into their place of business. As you can see, in any era, this profession has been drenched in societal judgment. And beyond those who chose the trade, there were many lives pulled into it, by misfortune, by poverty, by a world that offered no other way out of a very dark corner. If you think the Middle Ages had only one kind of prostitute, then think again. Never underestimate the medieval love for labelling. That society was obsessed with classifications. Not every woman who undressed for coin was tossed into the same basket. Oh no, there existed an unofficial yet widely recognised hierarchy of sex work. First, the common prostitutes, also known as streetwalkers. This was the most widespread class. They worked out of taverns, shipyards, market fairs, or the outskirts of ancient city walls. No private rooms, no silk dresses, and certainly no right to choose their clients. Anyone who could pay, they served. Their lives were built on impermanence, temporary food, temporary shelter, temporary affection, and barely breathing through it all. Second, the courtesans, the elite class. Now this group was given a bit more respect. Courtesans didn't just sell their bodies, they sold feelings, intellect, and refinement. They could sing, play instruments, and sometimes even read Latin. Their clients were nobles, wealthy merchants, men who preferred their wine with a side of poetry and clever conversation. Some courtesans became long-term lovers of lords or high officials, living in lavish homes and attending salons and feasts. Third, the independent women. These were women who entered the trade not out of desperation, but out of deliberate choice. Smart, self-aware, and savvy in both business and law, they set their own prices and navigated the fine line between morality and legality. Some worked to raise children, some paid off debts, and some, simply because it was profitable, they weren't victims. They were entrepreneurs in a most peculiar market. Lastly, the forced women, also known as sexual slaves. Sadly, this group was the largest yet the least spoken of. These were the girls kidnapped, sold, or coerced into serving in illegal brothels, or worse, forced into sexual slavery during military campaigns. Treated as nameless, voiceless playthings, their suffering was rarely acknowledged, and justice never came. So if someone were to ask, where did medieval prostitutes come from? The most honest answer would be, from everywhere, as long as it was the bottom. Because medieval society functioned like an enormous wedding cake. The top layer sipped wine, the middle layer nibbled on bread and thin soup, and the bottom layer, they ate whatever wouldn't kill them. And it was from that bottom crust that most of the era's sex workers were born into existence. First, the poor peasant girls. These were the primary suppliers. Born in the countryside into families with more mouths than farmland, many girls were forced to leave their villages and head to the city, hoping to find decent work. But in a society where the only acceptable jobs for women were either becoming someone's wife or washing laundry for the wealthy, many had no choice but to trade their bodies for survival. Second, orphans and illegitimate children. No parents, no protection, no dowry. These girls grew up like weeds by the roadside, unwanted, unclaimed, and unsheltered. When they reached puberty, they were easy prey for exploitation or coercion into prostitution. Sometimes, the ones who pushed them into it were the very guardians who had raised them, seeing them not as daughters, but as investments that could finally yield returns. Third, disgraced daughters of noble families. It sounds like something from a tragic romance novel, but it happened. Some noble women fell in love with the wrong man, became pregnant out of wedlock, or were disowned for tainting the family name. With no assets, no suitors, and no one willing to hire them, they were left with only one commodity left to sell: their own bodies. Fourth, women who were victims of war. After every battle, villages were burned, men were killed, and the women were left behind, with rubble, ghosts, and memories. No land, no protection, no family. They became easy targets for post-war prostitution rings. Many were trafficked across towns as spoils of a war no one remembered their names in. And finally, women who were once wives. It sounds bitter, but it's true. Countless women, after their husbands died or abandoned them, were plunged into poverty. With no trade, no land, no family willing to help, they sold everything they could, until all that remained was themselves. Ever since humanity began telling stories and assigning blame, fallen women have become figures of both condemnation and curious fascination. They were not only real people with real lives, but also the leading roles in countless tales. Morality plays rich in symbolism and staggeringly unjust messages. First and foremost comes the story of Eve, the one everyone knows by heart, born from a man's rib, naked in paradise, tempting man, and taking a bite from the wrong fruit. The result? All of humanity was exiled. Men were sentenced to toil the earth, and women to suffer childbirth. This tale laid the groundwork for the belief that woman is the root of all sin, and thus any woman who strayed from moral norms was quickly labelled a daughter of Eve, born to drag men into the abyss. In the eyes of the medieval world, any woman with an unclear profession or a slightly revealing dress could easily be lumped into the category of the improper, which meant dangerous, seductive, and worthy of punishment. Second comes the story of Magdalene, the woman whose past no one could forgive. In the Bible, Mary Magdalene is mentioned as someone once possessed by 7 demons, later healed by Jesus and becoming one of his most devoted followers. But over the centuries of retelling and reinterpretation, she was conveniently recast as the redeemed harlot. even though the Bible never actually states that she was a prostitute. People turned her into a symbol of repentance, and thus any woman in the beauty trade was encouraged to follow her example, leave the profession, weep bitterly, and retreat into the cold silence of a convent. The two archetypes of Eve and Magdalene, one who unleashed sin, the other forgiven for renouncing it, became the mythological framework that shaped the medieval view of fallen women. Because of this, prostitutes weren't just seen as sinners, but as living embodiments of humanity's collective failure, to be educated, reformed, or burned alive. There were even real-life moral plays as public warnings. A woman suspected of being a prostitute might be forced to play Eve in a town performance, which meant going topless, holding an apple, and enduring the jeers and curses of the crowd. A religious cosplay no one wanted the lead role in, and if you think medieval prostitutes were merely seen as misguided souls, think again. They were cast in far darker roles, from Satan's handmaidens to supernatural creatures that could seduce a man until he was bled dry. In many medieval folk tales, prostitutes were portrayed as the extended fingers of hell. One monk even preached that every time a man fell with a harlot, he moved one step closer to eternal damnation. People believed these women could lure men from the church to the brothel, from prayers to moans, with nothing but a glance. Some records tell of women being burned alive not for selling sex, but for being suspected of consorting with the devil. They were said to ensnare men with a whisper. In contrast to these demonic images, some tales shape prostitutes as fallen fairies, beautiful, enchanting, with a face that could make even knights abandon duty, but always accompanied by a curse. Whoever loved them would lose their mind, go bankrupt, or die mysteriously. There were stories of the woman in the red house at the edge of the village, whose singing could intoxicate hearts, but anyone who stayed the night would wake up penniless. One legend even claimed that some of them were forest spirits, cursed to seduce mortals in order to lift their spells. The result? Customers in a trance, villagers calling priests to exorcise evil. These legends, however fantastical, had very real consequences. They made men curious, and made it easier to punish women, because if she was a demon, a witch, or a fallen fairy, then capturing, beating, or burning her wasn't a crime. It was a holy purification, a moral cleansing of the community. In the end, the medieval prostitute was not just a real person, she became the protagonist of collective fears, from men's helplessness to society's moral confusion. She was a threat, a wet dream, and a scapegoat all at once. A justification for those who wanted to say, "I'm not weak, I was bewitched." And the irony, it was men who sought them out. It was male demand that created the market. But society condemned the women as the root of evil, while the men remained blameless. Because of course, it was someone else's fault. What do you think about this perspective? Let's discuss, so the Sleeping History team can hear your thoughts. Because even in the quietest corners of time, some questions still echo. Next, let us step inside the room where they lived and worked. A room no bigger than a chicken coop, damp like a wine cellar, dark and smelling, as if it hadn't been cleaned for centuries. But that very room was their stage of survival, where candlelight existed not for romance, but to illuminate the grime. Don't let the phrase brothel conjure anything glamorous. It wasn't cool or lovely. It was often dust grey and flesh-scented. In some cities, these places were even legalised, operating under local government oversight and, no joke, sometimes even under church supervision. The women working in licensed brothels had to pay taxes, follow strict regulations, like don't reveal client identities, no freelancing, and undergo periodic health checks, which usually meant a physician inspecting them with the naked eye. Many prostitutes worked part-time in taverns, where noise, ale and flickering torchlight made their marketing more effective than any printed flyer. A brush of the shoulder, a subtle lean, a raised glass, and the deal was sealed amid the laughter of drunken men. Unlicensed brothels were smaller houses, often tucked by the city walls or behind the market stalls. No signs, no protection, nothing but a stub of wax flickering in the corner, The women there lived like ghosts, unregistered, unspoken, but always present wherever wandering men passed through. Surprisingly, there are records of abandoned churches, left vacant after plague or war, being used as shelters for prostitutes. They placed beds under the bell tower, lit candles below the statues of saints, and occasionally welcomed clients beneath stained glass windows. And still, the customers came. Because medieval men were deeply religious, they believed that sinning was okay as long as repentance came quickly enough. Some would even pray immediately after, buckling their pants. "Forgive me, Lord, I've just finished. Now I'm ready to repent." Being a prostitute in the Middle Ages wasn't just manual labour, it was a sensory performance art. In a time before deodorant, before French perfume, and when shower gel sounded like black magic, staying presentable, or at least tolerable, was practically a sacred ordeal. And remember, if you didn't smell good, you smelled bad. There was no middle ground. They couldn't dress like nobility, but couldn't look like peasants either. They had to stand out, but not too richly. Be alluring, but not so much as to be arrested for indecency. The most common look? Low-neck dresses, slit bodices, and colours that screamed temptation. Red, purple, gold. Shoes were often wooden clogs, adding height and clicking loudly on cobblestones, announcing, "I'm coming, have your coins ready." Some tied cords around their waist to create fake curves, often fainting mid-shift from the tightness. Perfume? Not really, but they knew how to trick the nose. Dried herb bundles stuffed into cleavage. Thyme, lavender, or dried orange peels. Some boiled cinnamon bark and steamed their bodies in it. Others dabbed strong liquor onto their wrists, not for the scent, but to mask the smell. A signature scent in many brothels, pine resin. The floors were scrubbed with pine and ash water, leaving behind a very distinctive aroma. Some tips for long-lasting freshness included rubbing goat fat mixed with herbs onto the skin, chewing mint sprigs before conversations, gargling with red wine, hanging clothes in sunlight and dusting them with fireplace ash. Of course, some didn't care. One woman was famously funky, but still had plenty of clients. Why? She had technique. In a world without soap, body odour wasn't just hygiene, it was a survival strategy. And if you think medieval women didn't know how to beautify, try living one day without running water, deodorant or shampoo. Then head to your local cafe and see who wants to sit near you. And if you believe the clients of medieval prostitutes were only desperate, ugly men with no other options, congrats. You've been misled by TV dramas. In truth, men from all walks of life sought them out, so long as they had money, lust, or just wanted to try something different. In a world where wholesome entertainment consisted of praying, eating gruel, and working till your spine cracked, visiting a prostitute was basically a form of medieval stress relief. Men came not only for sex, but because they needed someone to listen to their rants about taxes, their frustration with wives, or their despair over poor harvests. Let's take a look at some of the highlight customer categories. First up, the knights, those who fight by day and stir up trouble by night. After battle, they often returned with three things: the stench of sweat, the spoils of the defeated, and an urgent need to unwind. They were usually generous, told grand tales of bravery, and the women didn't mind serving them, at least they paid up front. Next, the merchants, wealthy and lonely. Always on the road, eating irregular meals, often losing money. Merchants were in constant need of somewhere to shake off the bad luck. They haggled, talked too much, and had a habit of bragging about their wares while undressing. Some clever women used the chance to sell herbs, mouthwash brews, or even good luck charms. Then there were the clergymen, who came for research purposes. No surprise here. Records show that many monks and priests made pit stops at brothels during their spiritual journeys. Their reasons. I came to offer guidance. I'm studying sin for better sermons. Or the classic, I was tempted, by God's will, of course. Some even muttered prayers while undressing, blurring the line between baptism and damnation. In short, Medieval prostitutes weren't just sellers. They were therapists, diplomats, and silent confessors. They witnessed the darkest, funniest, and most naked parts of men. These women didn't just work with their bodies. They worked with their eyes, their words, and that precarious space between legality and survival. In a society where all power tilted toward men, survival for women meant mastering the art of manoeuvring. In many places, coins were scarce, so they accepted non-monetary payments like goose fat, chicken eggs, black bread, war gossip from the front lines, or household goods. The sharpest women always knew how to dodge danger. They knew who to avoid, who to flatter, and who to run from at the first glimpse down the alley. They wore smiles like armour and witty banter like hidden blades. Some even acted as informants, selling secrets to guards in exchange for the right to simply stay alive. If you think a prostitute's night was just about seeing clients, you're mistaken. Each evening was a packed itinerary: therapist, price negotiator, emotional interpreter, risk assessor. Their workday began when the sun went down. They'd light candles, brush hair, choose a dress that wasn't too torn, and tuck fragrant herbs into their bodice. If they worked in unlicensed houses, cleaning the workspace was the first chore. Then, time to hunt. Not every man walking by was a client. They had to read the gait, the eyes, judge whether the man was curious, cautious, or carrying coins. A skilled woman didn't call out or holler. All she needed was the right glance and the perfectly timed tilt of the shoulder. Once a man showed interest, negotiation began. Some spent 30 minutes just figuring out how many coins the guy actually had in his pouch. Each woman had her own service packages. Some sang lullabies, some told stories, some just sat and listened while a man cried about his failing crops. Whatever the offering, one rule applied: make sure he's satisfied and make sure he pays. When the client left, she carefully wiped away every trace, straightened the bed, counted the money, split it if she worked in a group, checked her body, and got ready for the next transaction. By midnight, she finally undressed, curled up by the fire to warm her feet. There might be more clients later, but for now, she could lie down. She didn't sleep deeply, but she dreamed in fragments: the smell of smoke, the taste of wine, the faint sting of mint, and the familiar sound. Her own quiet sigh. Not every encounter was your typical in-out pay lever arrangement. For some clients, especially the lonely, the superstitious, or those who'd read one too many love poems, paying for sex became a ritual. And the prostitute, she wasn't just a service provider, she was an actress, a guide, and the priestess of a deeply personal ceremony. Candlelight was the default setting for most intimate engagements, but for certain clients, each candle had to carry symbolic weight. White for purity, red for passion, black to ward off evil spirits. Some even insisted on exactly 7 candles, arranged in the shape of a pentagram. In those moments, the woman was no longer a prostitute. She was practically a sorceress. All she lacked was a pointed hat and a crucifix. Some clients, especially monks, liked to begin with prayer, not for the woman, but for themselves, to seek forgiveness before committing the sin. Some would even hold the girl's hand while whispering the Lord's Prayer, through tears. A seasoned woman knew: don't laugh, don't react. Just nod softly, rub his back, and murmur something like, "You're not alone." They weren't seeking sex. They were seeking absolution the church refused, but the bed pretended to offer. Some brought instruments, asking the girl to sing along. Others wanted music before anything began. Certain brothels even hired musicians to sit in the next room, playing live music to create the illusion of a grand theatre, even though the clients were seated on a creaking, lice-ridden bed. Many women learned to strum a few tunes on a lute, or sing soft, melancholic folk songs, not to set a romantic mood, but to make the client feel like the tragic hero of a beautiful play. In those fragile moments, the transaction became ritual, the sin turned to poetry, and the woman became a comforter of broken souls. She was no longer a harlot. She was the high priestess of inner chaos. And the sweat-drenched room transformed into a temporary sanctuary, where men came not only for release, but for relief. When the candlelight fades, the music stops, and the final client walks out into the night, one powerful presence still lingers in those damp little rooms, the law and the church. If you think the men who sat on judgment thrones or behind pulpits were entirely innocent, remember, medieval law had a talent for playing both sides. It condemned and it indulged. And the prostitute, she wasn't just part of the story. She was the pawn, the scapegoat, the moral alibi, and sometimes a mirror reflecting the hypocrisy of the entire system. Trials didn't just judge people, they judged the village's morality itself. When a prostitute was arrested, the question wasn't simply, is she guilty? But rather, is she a threat to society? Or is she just revealing an uncomfortable truth about that society? In many places, prostitution was considered a crime of violating public decency, which meant she dared to engage in adult matters without a license, without paying taxes, and worst of all, without giving men anyone else to blame for their own weaknesses. They were punished not for seducing men, but for being impossible to ignore. A woman with no husband, no father, no male guardian was not seen as a valid citizen. So when she was tricked, assaulted, or raped, she couldn't press charges. In some cases, a raped woman was punished for not resisting hard enough. Her crime? Letting it happen. This wasn't justice. It was theatre, a moral play staged for the comfort of a guilty crowd. Does any of this sound familiar? Today, when you hear about a sexual assault and scroll past thousands of online comments, you'll still find echoes of these medieval minds. People blaming the victim, her clothes, her walk, her smile, as if she was inviting the crime. But all you can do is feel sorry for those still trapped in a mindset that hasn't moved forward in over 1,000 years. So medieval cities needed prostitutes, not because they cared about them, but because they feared what men might do without a release valve. And so, the authorities quietly allowed a few temporary relief zones. Then, when public outrage boiled over, they'd drag a few women to court to calm the crowd and keep up appearances. In these moments, prostitutes became societal pressure vents, like bathroom exhaust fans. Everyone needs one. No one wants to look at it. If you ever thought medieval law was something clear, logical, or what's banned must be punished, welcome to reality. A place where regulations could contradict themselves and still work just fine for centuries. Prostitution was one of those subjects that threw the law into a constant state of disgusted dependence. They outlawed it to appease the public, but they licensed it to appease the crown. And the prostitute, always stuck in the middle, always being squeezed between morality and utility. Many city-states issued moral decrees like no public indecency, no sex outside marriage for profit, no revealing clothing. But somehow, these laws were nailed right outside the officially licensed brothel. You'd walk past a wooden sign saying prostitution forbidden, and 2 steps later, you'd reach another reading. The Gentle Rose House, open from dusk till dawn. In many towns, sex work was temporarily allowed if it followed rules like registering with the city council, passing health checks via eyeballing, not operating near schools, churches or noble estates. Some places even had official price caps and dress codes. Green dresses meant licensed. Red ones meant underground. Officials looked the other way. Clergy pretended not to know. Citizens claimed not to care, but still showed up at night. And the law? It just sat there, like a morality hat that only covers the top of your head, but leaves the mouth exposed. Medieval prostitutes lived in a half-legal world, threatened by bans, yet forced to pay taxes under permits. One law punished them for being caught. Another law fined them for not being caught and not reporting income. And if any institution held both a stick and an umbrella, it was the church. With near total power to shape public morality, the church had the loudest voice in condemning prostitutes. But those who preached chastity were often the most loyal customers at the brothels. What a cruel irony, but perhaps the most human of truths. On the outside, virtue. On the inside, rot. Clerics warned their flocks to stay away from fallen women. They called them snakes in human skin, traps laid by Satan. But when night fell, many priests quietly left their pulpits, walked the dark streets, and entered the very doors they had just condemned. When caught, the most popular excuses were, "I was counselling her toward repentance. The Lord is testing my will. I took a wrong turn." In some places, the church even helped manage brothels, their reasoning, better regulated than rampant. One monastery even took a cut of profits, labelled as moral supervision fees. Some priests acted as mediators during disputes between sex workers and clients, and surprise, they always sided with whoever dropped more coins into the donation box. After every festival season, churches held mass confession sessions. Men came forward asking forgiveness for unspeakable things. The church seized the moment to sermonize, demand stricter control of prostitution, but never actually shut it down. Because if there were no sex workers, who would confess? And if no one sinned, what would the priest say on Sunday? If you think church-owned brothels is just a dark joke, congratulations, you've underestimated the medieval church's ability to moralize everything, even sin for profit. Not every church did it, but at one point in time, in certain places the church really did own, rent out, or bless brothels. Why? Because if sin is inevitable, you might as well earn a percentage from every fool. In certain European cities, brothels were built on land owned by the church, and were required to pay a monthly offering. In exchange, they received protection from police raids, and in some cases, even a New Year's blessing from the local priest. In some towns, brothels were allowed to operate next to monasteries, as long as customers didn't laugh too loudly and disrupt prayer time. Some convents took in lost women, but instead of helping them repent, they simply let them continue working, so long as they contributed a portion of their earnings to maintain the monastery. There were monasteries that secretly ran special areas called rest quarters, where men weary from sin were offered intimate therapies to help heal their tired spirits. For certain clergy, church involvement in brothel oversight wasn't a sin, but a practical solution to communal sin. If sex work was regulated, customers stayed healthy, and no one harmed children, then that was considered controlled moral collapse. Now, if you think medieval punishments were limited to whipping, jailing, or burning, you've underestimated the creativity of the time, especially when it came to prostitutes, those despised yet conveniently used women. Punishments were often wildly imaginative. First up, the rope, a versatile disciplinary tool. It wasn't just for hanging, sometimes it was tied to a woman's wrist, and the other end to a donkey's tail. She would then be led through the market square, a living billboard warning others about the dangers of dressing indecently. Next, chains. Some towns forced prostitutes to wear iron shackles engraved with the words "property of the state." They were heavy, ugly, and clanked loudly with every step. Each sound whispered, "I no longer belong to myself." Others were forced to wear iron masks with a tongue-shaped piece that jutted out, preventing them from speaking, and more importantly from soliciting customers. Third, marriage to a soldier. In special cases, instead of punishment, a prostitute might be ordered to marry a soldier, usually an old drunk or one about to retire. The court's logic: you corrupted a man's morals, now redeem him by living with him forever. The result? The woman was forced to give up her freedom of trade and become a full-time wife, often living with someone worse than her previous clients. Under medieval legal thinking, prostitutes and witches were technically different. One sold her body, the other sold her soul, but in reality they were often tried under the same charge: dangerous women. And sadly that crime frequently ended in flames. Medieval courts didn't need hard evidence. All it took was a man losing control of his emotions. If a man abandoned his family, sold his land, or wept after leaving a brothel, the woman was accused of casting a spell. In short, if a man couldn't control something, then the woman who triggered it was guilty. Prostitutes were often punished for public indecency. Witches were punished for practicing sorcery. But if a woman happened to do both, the court wouldn't know which law to apply. and would often settle the matter by burning her anyway. Common evidence for witchcraft included owning a black cat, being able to read, refusing to marry, smelling mysteriously fragrant prostitutes were usually hanged or exiled. Witches were given the privilege of long trials, which might include boiling water, ropes, or interrogation via scripture. But in times of public panic, both would be burned as a way to cleanse the community of evil. And yet, despite the laws, the whips, the flames, many women still became prostitutes. You know why? Because for most of them, fate had slammed every other door shut. Beneath the dresses scented with herbs, beneath the inviting appearances lay a quiet and brutal truth. Medieval prostitutes didn't just face society's scorn, the church's exploitation, and the government's contradictory laws. They were also victims of a far more silent enemy, slow deaths from disease and from neglect. Illness didn't need an invitation. It crept through alleyways, clung to mattresses, and stayed, like an expected part of life. If nobles had physicians, rare herbs, and private rooms for recovery, prostitutes had nothing more than fireplace ashes, a handful of sage leaves, and whispered prayers like, "Please, don't take me tonight." They rarely saw real doctors, not because they didn't need help, but because they had no money, no legal status, and frankly, no one who cared. Who would treat them? No one. All they had were old folk remedies passed from one woman to another. No gloves, no antibiotics, no disinfectant, just reckless hope, and a prayer that by morning it might pass. Medical treatments often involved blunt dinner knives, the heated tips of candles, sharpened chopsticks made from wood infection was more rule than risk. And medicine was mostly metaphor. When people didn't understand a disease, they blamed it on immorality. If you were a woman, especially a prostitute, you were automatically suspect. No tests, no symptoms required. If your dress was bright and you stood too close, that was enough. Lacking science, they leaned on superstition. Garlic cloves were chewed each morning to chase away demons. Goat droppings mixed with wine were applied to the belly to cleanse the womb. Bat blood was dropped into ears or dabbed on pillows to prevent syphilis. Urine, especially from a virgin, was used for bathing to wash off sin. These remedies were not only useless, they were dangerous. But in a world where nothing could be trusted, people clung to anything. During every major plague of the Middle Ages, from Black Death to leprosy to syphilis, prostitutes were always the first to be blamed. If someone in town got a fever or died suddenly, fingers pointed at unmarried women, fatherless women, women who didn't belong to any moral community. The church declared these outbreaks as punishment from God for sexual sins. Priests preached that the brothel is the gateway to death. Even if the patient was a nobleman or a merchant, the blame still fell on the prostitute. Some were beaten, locked in animal pens, or left in the town square to die, simply for coughing. Others were forced to keep working even during epidemics, because as one saying went, "They're already filthy. What harm can one more night do?" They became tools of relief for soldiers, for the lonely, for respectable men looking for comfort. And in society's dying gasps, their bodies were once again used, without ever being asked. Every symptom, from a headache or nausea to deep lingering sorrow, was blamed not on biology, but on moral decay. If a woman was in pain, it was because she had sinned, and if she was a prostitute, she didn't even deserve a diagnosis. Her illness is obvious, they'd say. Her body is already a punishment. What passed for treatment was nothing more than disguised torture, cutting into the skin to release demons, forcing her to drink mercury, burning herbs over the womb to cleanse impure blood. There was no concept of bacteria, no understanding of hygiene, of inflammation, or cellular repair, no anesthesia, no recovery, just a slow unravelling, day after day. After years of working without protection, their bodies broke down mercilessly. Chronic infections damaged the uterus. Tubes became blocked. Periods vanished. Pain never did. They developed ulcers, deformities in the mouth, the nose, the hands. Some wore veils for the rest of their lives, not to entice, but to hide what the world had done to them. The body that had once been desired, negotiated and bought, became a monument to the brutality of the age. Their lives ended not in violence, but in slow, aching neglect. Infections without medicine, fevers without end, exhaustion that devoured from within. They died quietly, alone, unnoticed. No one held a funeral, no bells rang, no candles were lit. Their beds were given to others, their few belongings divided or discarded, and just like that, they vanished. Death for them was not an ending. It was the final act of erasure. They had no names in the church books, no relatives to remember them, no one to write down that they had ever existed. If they died from disease, their bodies were dumped outside the city, burned with the garbage, or buried hastily at the edge of the cemetery. No gravestones, just cold dirt, scattered stones and weeds, growing, dying like they once did. Sometimes, at the corner of an old street, a few friends, usually other working women, would light a small candle, place a few petals, and hum a lullaby that sounded like grief. There was no priest, no sermon, only those who had once lived beside her, now saying goodbye, softly, truly, and with a sorrow that lingered in the bones. History remembers some people through books. Others, like them, are remembered only through footprints in muddy alleys, the faint scent of dried sage on an old shawl, and a few quiet tears shed where no one was looking. After sickness, death, and oblivion comes a quieter ache, deeper than any physical wound, love. Nothing shatters a heart faster than loving someone who will never love you back. And for a medieval prostitute, that was not a rare tragedy. It was a daily ritual, as regular as the morning church bell. In a world where honour was measured by the length of your skirt, and a marriage vow meant more than the Bible itself, a prostitute, though she had a heart, feelings, and small secret dreams, was not allowed to use them. She could offer her body, but never ever her love. Love for her was a luxury, as rare as white bread, as sacred as red wine, as impossible as a faithful man, and she was never invited to the feast. Sometimes she'd feel her heart stir at a gentle glance, a simple question. "Have you eaten today?" Especially in a year when no one else bothered to ask. She would dream of a world where she was loved for who she was, not what she gave. But when morning came, and the familiar rustle of coins hit the table, she would remember he was playing the lover, and she had believed it. Some bonds did go beyond the exchange of coins, moonlit walks, dry bread shared between two hands, a song drifting from a distant lute, and for a moment, just a moment, everything felt real, until one day he arrived with sparkling eyes and news that he was getting married, not to her, but to the daughter of a count, a woman with land, a dowry, a father, a name written in the baptism registry. She had only a name whispered in the dark. There had been promises, eyes that swore freedom, a future, the hope that one day she'd leave this life behind. But the man disappeared. Some returned, not to love, but to accuse her of witchcraft. Some sent wedding invitations, not to invite, but to announce. Over time, they learned not to fall in love, not because they couldn't feel, but because feelings were a costly loss. Every love meant fewer clients, less money, and losing a piece of herself she could never afford to give. So they smiled, poured wine, whispered sweet words to strange men, but inside their hearts were locked, tight, silent, like a sealed chest in a monastery. There may have once been someone who held the key, but now the key was long gone. To be forbidden from loving was one thing, but to love the wrong person, when you were someone not allowed to love at all, was a recipe for heartbreak, candlelight, and false oaths whispered too late. The priests who vowed chastity often visited to test their resolve. The nobles who claimed virtue were drawn to what they were told to fear. Even high-born women, surrounded by etiquette and silks, sometimes came to the brothel, not for lust, but for listening without judgment, And sometimes the deepest intimacy was found in silence, in simply sitting together, not touching, not speaking, just being. When a prostitute became pregnant, no one asked if it was a boy or a girl. The first question was always, "Are you keeping it?" Because the child was never just a child. It was a trace, a burden, a question no one wanted to answer. The law did not make the father responsible. Society didn't care. And as for the men themselves, most couldn't remember who they'd been with that month. Some women tried. They carried the child to the gates of castles, knocked with trembling hands, and hoped for a sliver of justice. But what they received was a silent shake of the head. And so, the child grew up, fatherless, nameless, with no inheritance, not even an explanation. These children lived in the slums, beside the smell of old blood, stale wine, and curses thrown like stones by strangers. They were called bastards. Even when given the rare chance to attend school, they'd still be asked, "Who's your father?" A question meant as a joke, but one that cut like a blade. The girls, born of discarded women, often followed the same path. When their mothers were sick, dead, or simply too poor to feed them, they took up the trade. No one taught them to read, but many were eager to teach them how to survive. The boys became ghosts. No friends, no inheritance, no bride. They grew up and vanished from history as if they had never lived. Some became thieves, mercenaries, but some survived. They became blacksmiths. Some were taken in by kind old women. Some by chance met a priest with a soft heart. They were not proud of where they came from, but they weren't ashamed either, because they understood. No one chooses where they are born, but you can choose how to stay alive. Not all prostitutes dreamed of being queens. They didn't need castles, or silk sheets, or goose-feather beds. What they longed for, however silly it might sound, was just a single evening without pretending to moan. A morning where they didn't have to put on rouge in a hurry for the next appointment. A small home. A man who wasn't rich, but could cook, could ask how they felt, and wouldn't crush their body under his feet. But that thing called a normal life was the most expensive dream. They tried. They burned the dresses, tossed away the makeup, changed their names. They asked to be maids, goose-herders, stonebreakers by the river, but the stain, like oil on linen, could not be washed away. Even dressed modestly, even far from their past, they still felt the stares. People would ask, "What did you used to do?" And when the answer slipped out, smiles faded instantly. No one yelled, no one hit. But silence stung worse than any insult ever could. They were looked at like stains in a world obsessed with purity, and they learned, to be accepted, you must first have a clean past. Many returned to the old trade, not because they loved it, but because there was nowhere else to go. At least in those small, dusty rooms they knew how to survive. No one pretended they were pure, and no one asked them to pretend. If life was a stage, prostitutes were the actors who never got to leave the role. Whether they were crying, loving, or just tired, they had to perform. Their love stories, if they existed, rarely ended, because they never truly began. They had loved, even knowing they were just the emotional trash bin for someone else's passing desires. They had waited. They had listened for familiar footsteps. They had spent their savings on sweet cakes for someone they loved, only to be told they were too filthy to eat with. One fell in love with a rich man. He promised to take her away. She believed. She prepared. But on the promised day he arrived, arm in arm with his fiancée. All the sweet words turned out to be rehearsed lines in a play he never meant to finish. They had acted too well. So well they started to believe the script. And when the curtain fell, there was no applause, no music, just a cold blanket and two empty eyes staring up at the ceiling. The next morning they put on lipstick again. They smiled. They opened the door, because if love is a tragedy, then they were the most seasoned performers of all. In the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about love. It was a contract, a document certifying who was and wasn't worthy of becoming a spouse. And prostitutes, they rarely made the list. The law didn't forbid them from marrying, but it did nothing to protect them from rejection. The law said, everyone has the right to marry. Reality said, but no one wants to marry you. Do you think they deserved it? Or was it society that was too cruel to ever let them become anything more than what it believed them to be? When abandoned, the price of old age and loneliness, the career span of a medieval prostitute was as short as a midday nap. If there had been pensions, most wouldn't have lived long enough to sign their name. In a world where youth was currency, time didn't bring wisdom, only made them cheaper by the night. They did not enter the trade through any grand door. They came in through alleyways. Some were sold like livestock. Some woke up in brothels after a cup of drugged wine. And some walked in willingly, because hunger and shivering limbs left them nothing else to barter. They began at 15, an age meant for fairy tales and schoolbooks. Instead, they were trained to please, to serve, to beckon. The first lesson was simple. Satisfy everything the customer wants. At 18, the age most call beautiful, they were queens, deluxe, youth with a price tag. But their crowns were wine glasses, leering eyes, and the question, how much for the night? Some mistook a bent copper ring for a promise, a coat left behind for affection. But they learned. Rings were spare, coats were forgotten, and love was never part of the transaction. By 25, they began to feel the cold wind. Not from the window, but from the way people looked at them. Clients forgot their names. Younger girls arrived. Cheaper, softer, newer. No one kicked them out. They simply weren't seen anymore. The candlelight didn't reach their corners. They still smiled. Still painted lips. Still worked. But fewer men wanted what they offered. By 28, an age that should have been radiant, they were called old whores. Their backs ached, their eyes blurred, their bodies worn thin. Some began selling vegetables. Some raised chickens, some opened taverns, some became matchmakers. But none of them were ever chosen as wives. A few disappeared, dying slowly, like oil lamps flickering out before dawn. No one blew them out. No one noticed. Some died in rented rooms. Some were buried hastily at the graveyard's edge. Some walked away, aboard merchant ships leaving behind towns that had drained every drop of their youth. The ship left. It never returned. Maybe they died. Maybe they lived. But to live with no one remembering, is that not its own kind of death? A few sat in churches, fingering rosaries made from shell beads, eyes closed as if asleep. They didn't confess. They didn't pray. They just sat. And when the bells stopped ringing, they slipped away like ghosts. They were a presence people only ever spoke of with disgust, with pity, with shame. No one ever truly came close, and yet their image lives on to this day. In the pages of medieval literature, especially in manuscripts copied by monks, prostitutes were never depicted as whole people. They had no names, no clear origins, and certainly no right to speak their own truths. Instead, they became symbols of sin, of temptation, of things one must not desire. The words, steeped in bias, painted them as smouldering fire pits, bottomless wells, or still waters running dangerously deep, images meant to provoke fear, not empathy. In morality plays, the prostitute always wore red, seduced good men into darkness, and was punished in the end as if her very existence was a crime. And yet, even as villains, they often had more charisma, more depth, and more presence than any other character. Why? Because they reflected the things society refused to face: hypocrisy in holy robes, virtue worn as disguise, and longing so suppressed they turned into monsters. In other forms of literature, folk songs, street poems, the prostitute appeared differently, closer, sadder, more human. In a world where one could die of cold faster than sin, she was sometimes the only one brave enough to stand against the mob. Her presence became a mirror for a rotting world. As time went on, her image began to shift. No longer just a symbol of evil, she was seen with more nuance, as a woman who once loved and was hurt, who understood life and remained kind despite the cruelty. Thus emerged the figure of the courtesan, wise, sharp, dignified, not because she sought praise, but because she had long understood how the world worked. This change wasn't just about evolving taste. It was the first quiet step toward humanization. The moment literature dared to see her as a person rather than a symbol, society could no longer look away. Because if even the lowest of the low could rise and live with dignity, then who really was lost? Still, as with all things in art, this romanticization brought its own distortions. Modern films often portray prostitutes with flawless skin, soft curls and eyes brimming with backstory. They have gentle clients, clean bed sheets, and long evenings to reflect on life. It's beautiful, but not real. Medieval life had no sterile clinics. They lived in filth, faced daily violence, sickness, and scorn. Not everyone got a tragic love theme. Even today, in an age of progress, echoes of those old judgments remain. A woman too bold, too smart, too unapologetically herself can still be branded with the same old label. Though art has elevated their image, society often still reduces it to a symbol, either sin or sacrifice. And that is precisely what makes their existence so vital. They are not side characters in the drama of civilization. They are reminders that history always tries to erase those who expose its rot. There are no statues for them, no cathedrals etched with their names. But they lived. We know this because we still speak of them, not with sermons, but with a question. How can a society call itself moral if women like her still had to exist? Perhaps the true legacy of the medieval prostitute is not what she did, but what she forced an entire civilization to confront in its own reflection. And so, the story of the Scarlet Women of the Middle Ages comes to a close, not with a sword, nor with a curse, but with whispers echoing across the centuries. These women were not just victims, nor sins given flesh, but living witnesses to an era of contradiction and colour. They, the girls of the night, beneath flickering candlelight and rooftops rattling in the wind, once lived, once laughed, once loved, and once resisted in ways only they knew. Though society nailed them to walls of shame with prejudice and prophecy, it was they who kept the fire burning, telling stories that never truly went out. Now, if you close your eyes, let the echoes of their lives lull you into sleep, like the soft hum of a courtesan bidding the night farewell, or the first church bell welcoming morning. And when you wake, remember this. No matter how deeply history hides behind darkness and doctrine, there were always those who stepped out of the shadow, who dared to live honestly, tenderly, and left footprints that time could never erase. May you sleep in peace tonight, with dreams full of ancient tales, bitter, sweet, and always beautifully human.